Were you hoping for a Pinterest perfect wedding with a soulmate? You swiped right on. Maybe a quiet proposal, a shimmering diamond, and vows about true love conquering all. Well, hold on to your medieval hats, because if you lived in the Middle Ages, your expectations for a walk down the aisle would have been wild. What if your family already picked your spouse for you? What if you were considered an adult at 12 years old and ready for marriage? What if love had absolutely nothing to do with it? Let's take a deep dive into the shocking reality of medieval unions, from around the 11th century to the late 15th century. Number 11. Being expected to get married for alliances, not affection. Forget about finding your soulmate, or someone who truly understood your quirky sense of humor. In the medieval world, marriage was less about hearts and flowers, and much more about strategic partnerships. It was a serious business deal, a political maneuver, and an economic transaction all rolled into one heavily embroidered package. When a family, especially a noble one, decided it was time for their child to marry, the first questions asked were not, do they love each other, or do they share common interests? Instead, the inquiries revolved around, what land does this union bring? Or, what political influence can we gain? Or, will this marriage strengthen our family's standing against that troublesome neighbor? This expectation meant that children, sometimes from their very infancy, had their future spouses chosen for them. Royal and noble families were particularly entangled in this web of alliances. King might marry his daughter to the son of a rival kingdom to forge a peace treaty, ending years of bloody conflict. The young princess, barely old enough to understand the intricacies of diplomacy, would be sent across borders to a new land, a new culture, and a new family, all in the name of political stability. Her personal feelings were simply not a factor in this grand game of thrones. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, certainly experienced this. She was married to Louis VII of France when she was just a teenager, a match made for political convenience. Later, her marriage to Henry II of England was another power play, creating the vast Angevin Empire. These were not choices made by Eleanor, but by the circumstances of her birth and the ambitions of those around her. Commoners, too, felt the weight of this expectation, though perhaps on a smaller scale. A peasant family might arrange a marriage for their son or daughter with a family from a neighboring village to pool resources, to gain access to more fertile land, or simply to ensure both families had enough hands for harvesting. The goal was survival and betterment, not personal happiness. A local lord might even have a say in who his tenants married. Wanting to ensure the stability of his workforce and the continued productivity of his land, the idea of eloping for love would have been seen as reckless, irresponsible, and potentially ruinous for both families involved. It threatened the social order and the economic fabric of their community. Parents often spent years negotiating these arrangements. Messengers would travel between families, discussing dowries, future inheritances, and the exact wording of the marriage contract. Prospective bride and groom often had little to no say in the matter. They might not even meet until shortly before the wedding, or sometimes not until the wedding day itself. Their first encounter might happen at the church door, surrounded by witnesses. With their fate already sealed, the medieval concept of love was different from ours. It was often something that developed after marriage, born from shared life, mutual respect, and the raising of children. Romantic love, as we understand it, was often viewed as a dangerous, disruptive force, something to be wary of, especially in the context of marriage. Ballads and troubadour songs celebrated courtly love, but this was an idealized, often unconsummated form of affection, distinct from the practical reality of marital unions. Your feelings simply did not feature in the grand calculations of family legacy and societal structure. Number 10. Accepting your spouse as a legal and economic partner, not just a romantic one. When you entered into a medieval marriage, you were not just gaining a life partner. You were signing up for a complex legal and economic arrangement that redefined your entire existence. This expectation was foundational to the institution of marriage during the Middle Ages, far outweighing any consideration of romance or personal preference. For women especially, marriage was the primary pathway to social legitimacy and financial security. Unmarried women, particularly those from noble or wealthy backgrounds, faced a much more precarious future, often relegated to convents or dependent on the charity of relatives. A wife's legal identity often became subsumed into her husband's, a concept known as coverture in English law. Under coverture, a married woman could not own property independently, make contracts, or sue or be sued in her own name. Her husband was her legal representative in almost all matters. This meant that all the property a woman brought into the marriage, whether it was land, money, or goods, typically became her husband's to manage and control. This was part of the dowry, a crucial element of medieval marriage negotiations. The dowry was a sum of money, goods, or estate that a wife brought to her husband upon marriage, and it was a significant part of what made a woman desirable as a bride. A larger dowry could secure a more advantageous match for a woman, elevating her family's status or solidifying an alliance. For the husband, the dowry represented an immediate increase in his wealth and resources, which could be used to expand his holdings, fund ventures, or simply improve his standard of living. However, the dowry was usually meant to revert to the wife's family upon her death, if there were no children, or to her children upon her death. It was not entirely a gift to the husband to dispose of as he pleased, but rather a complex form of financial transaction within the marital bond. In return for the dowry and the general responsibility for his wife, the husband was expected to provide for her and protect her. This was not a romantic gesture, but a legal and social obligation. He was responsible for her debts, for her actions, and for her general well-being. This reciprocal arrangement ensured that both parties had specific roles within the marital economy. For men, marriage meant taking on these serious financial and legal responsibilities, but it also granted them access to their wife's dowry and the potential for heirs, which was critical for continuing their family line and inheriting property. For women, marriage was a trade-off, a loss of legal independence in exchange for social standing, security, and the opportunity to become a mistress of a household. The details of these economic arrangements were meticulously laid out in marriage contracts, which were often extensive legal documents drawn up by scribes and witnessed by numerous parties. These contracts specified the dowry, the dower, the portion of her husband's estate set aside for the wife's support in widowhood, and often included clauses about inheritance, future children's provisions, and even the circumstances under which the marriage could be annulled. These documents underscore the fact that medieval marriage was fundamentally a property transaction, a way of consolidating wealth, securing bloodlines, and maintaining social hierarchies. The emphasis was on property management and continuation of family lineage, not on shared hobbies or emotional connection. If you were a medieval individual, you were expected to view your marital union as a functional partnership first and foremost, a powerful engine for family advancement and economic stability, with romance being an optional, often secondary bonus. Number 9. Navigating the complexities of dowry and dower. Let's talk money, or more accurately, property. In the medieval world, if you were contemplating marriage, you were automatically thrust into the intricate and often high-stakes world of dowry and dower. This wasn't just about wedding gifts. It was about the financial backbone of the marriage itself and the security of both spouses, especially the bride, in a time when social welfare nets simply did not exist. The dowry was the property or money that the bride's family brought to the groom upon marriage. It was essentially the bride's contribution to the new marital household, and it could be incredibly substantial. Think about it. A father might spend years accumulating a suitable dowry for his daughter, understanding that a generous one would make her a more attractive prospect and potentially secure her a husband of higher status or greater wealth. The dowry could take many forms. It might be a large sum of gold coins, a specified amount of land, valuable livestock, finely woven textiles, or even rights to certain rents or services. The value of the dowry was a significant point of negotiation between the two families involved. These negotiations could be lengthy and arduous, often involving lawyers and scribes, as every detail had to be meticulously documented. A family might argue about the exact number of acres, the quality of the cattle, or the amount of ready cash. For the Grooms family, receiving a substantial dowry meant an immediate injection of capital and resources, which could be used to expand their estates, fund military campaigns, or simply improve their family's living conditions. For the bride, her dowry represented her family's investment in her future, a vital part of her financial security within the marriage. It was typically held by the husband who managed it, but it was understood to be her family's contribution and was often meant to pass to her children. Then there was the dower. While the dowry came from the bride's family, the dower was the portion of the husband's estate that was set aside for the wife's support in the event of his death. It was her insurance policy, a crucial safety net in a society where widows could easily fall into poverty. Typically, the dower consisted of 1/3 of the husband's lands or income. This proportion was fairly standard across much of medieval Europe, though it could vary based on local customs or specific agreements. The dower was her right to use and benefit from that property for the rest of her life as a widow. It did not become her absolute property to sell or give away, but it ensured she had a roof over her head, food on her table, and the means to maintain a respectable household after her husband passed. The intricate dance between dowry and dower meant that marriage was a serious financial commitment for both families. A prospective groom's family would scrutinize the dowry offer, while the bride's family would ensure the dower provisions were adequate to protect their daughter's future. The expectation was that you understood these financial complexities and played by the rules. Trying to marry without a dowry for a woman was extremely difficult, often relegating her to a lower status marriage or to a convent. For a man, taking a wife without a dowry meant foregoing a significant financial benefit which could hinder his family's economic standing. These arrangements were not optional romantic gestures. They were central to the economic stability and social standing of medieval families, underscoring that marriage was as much a financial transaction as it was a personal union. Number 8. Embracing the prospect of child marriage. Put away any thoughts of a sweet 16th or even an 18th birthday before marriage. In the medieval period, the expectation of marrying young was not just common. It was the norm, particularly for girls. While the church set the minimum age for valid marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, actual betrothals and even marriages often occurred much earlier. It was not unheard of for children to be betrothed in their infancy, with the understanding that the marriage would be consummated when they reached the canonical age. This practice was deeply rooted in the practical realities of the time, driven by family ambitions, the desire to secure alliances, and the imperative to produce heirs. For noble families, early marriage was a strategic imperative. Betrothing young children allowed powerful families to solidify long-term alliances, prevent rivals from making competing claims, and ensure the orderly transfer of land and titles. A betrothal often served as a preliminary, yet binding, agreement. Think of it as a pre-contract, ensuring that the deal was sealed before anyone could change their mind. Children involved would grow up knowing who their future spouse was, even if they had no personal connection or affection for them. For example, Isabella of Angoulême, Queen of England, was reportedly betrothed at a very young age before King John of England stepped in to marry her himself, an act that shocked many and was a major source of political drama. This shows how fluid and politically charged these early arrangements could be. Even among commoners, early marriage was practical. Girls were expected to contribute to the household economy, whether through domestic chores, helping in the fields, or assisting with crafts. Marrying young allowed them to transition into their adult roles as wives and mothers, beginning the process of childbearing as soon as they were physically able. High infant mortality rates meant that producing many children was essential to ensure that some would survive to adulthood and carry on the family name and labor. A young bride had more childbearing years ahead of her, increasing the chances of securing healthy heirs. While the church set minimum ages, these were often about legal capacity for consent and consummation, not necessarily emotional maturity. A 12-year-old girl might be legally old enough to consent to marriage, but her understanding of the institution and her responsibilities within it would be vastly different from a modern teenager's. The expectation was that these young individuals would learn their roles within the marriage as they grew up, guided by their families and the customs of their community. There was no concept of a childhood in the way we understand it today. Once past infancy, children were often seen as miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household and prepare for their adult responsibilities, with marriage being one of the most significant. So, if you were born in the Middle Ages, you would have been expected to accept that your journey to matrimony could begin long before you even hit your growth spurt, all for the practical considerations of family lineage and survival. Number 7. Fulfilling the solemn duty of procreation, especially for male heirs. When you entered a medieval marriage, the expectation that you would procreate and produce as many children as possible, especially sons, was not just strong. It was practically a divine commandment. Forget about choosing when or if to have children. This was a fundamental reason for marriage itself, enshrined by both society and the church. The medieval world was a harsh place, fraught with high mortality rates from disease, famine, and conflict. Ensuring the continuation of the family line was paramount, a matter of survival, inheritance, and social standing. For men, particularly those of noble or landowning status, producing a male heir was an overwhelming burden and a crucial duty. A son meant the continuation of the family name, the inheritance of lands and titles, and the preservation of power. Without a male heir, a family line could die out. Its lands might revert to the lord, or its titles could pass to distant relatives, dissolving centuries of carefully built legacy. The pressure on a wife to produce sons was immense. If she produced only daughters or worse, no children at all, her position within the marriage could become precarious. She might face social scorn, and her husband might even seek an annulment on the grounds of non-consummation or barrenness, a devastating blow to her status and future. King Henry VIII's desperate search for a male heir in the 16th century, leading to his multiple marriages in the English Reformation, is a dramatic illustration of this societal pressure. Even if slightly later than our core medieval period, it reflects the enduring medieval mindset. For women, the primary purpose of marriage was often seen as childbearing. The woman's fertility was her most valuable asset, and her ability to produce healthy offspring, especially sons, determined much of her worth within the marital bond and society. Pregnancy and childbirth were incredibly dangerous, often leading to the death of the mother, the child, or both. Yet women were expected to endure these risks repeatedly throughout their fertile years, all in the pursuit of heirs. The average woman might have several pregnancies, often spaced closely together, hoping that a few children would survive to adulthood. Church, too, strongly emphasized procreation as one of the main purposes of marriage, along with avoiding sin. Sexual relations within marriage were largely seen as legitimate for the purpose of having children. Any sexual act not aimed at procreation was often frowned upon. This pervasive expectation meant that couples were not just forming an emotional bond. They were entering into a biological contract with society. The discussions around a marriage, even for commoners, would often implicitly or explicitly involve the expectation of fertility. A young couple starting their life together was immediately under pressure to demonstrate their ability to conceive and bear children, ensuring the continuity of their lineage and the stability of their family's place in the world. Your personal desires or feelings about having children were secondary to this overriding societal imperative. Number 6. Living under the strictures of gender. If you were a medieval person, you were born into a world where gender roles were not just customary. They were rigidly defined, deeply ingrained in society, and reinforced by the church and law. There was little room for deviation, and your expectations for marriage were entirely shaped by these predetermined roles. A husband and wife were expected to operate within their separate yet complementary spheres, forming a household unit where each knew their place and performed their assigned duties. For men, the expectation was to be the head of the household, the primary provider, and the protector. This meant working the land if a commoner, or managing estates, fighting wars, and engaging in politics if a noble. A man's role was to be active in the public sphere, to ensure the family's economic stability and to defend its interests. He was expected to be strong, decisive, and authoritative. He held legal dominion over his wife and children, and his word was largely law within his domain. His success was measured by the prosperity of his lands, the number of his healthy children, and his standing in the community. His duties might involve long absences for war, trade, or political gatherings, leaving his wife to manage the household. For women, the expectations were primarily domestic and centered around the home and family. Her role was to be a diligent housewife, managing the household, raising children, and supervising servants if the family was wealthy enough to afford them. She was expected to be pious, obedient, and modest. Her sphere was the private realm, maintaining order within the home, preparing food, making clothing, and educating young children. Even for noble women, while they might possess significant administrative skills in managing large estates in their husband's absence, their primary identity was still tied to their role as wife and mother. For commoner women, their daily lives involved back-breaking labor, from tending gardens and livestock to spinning wool and weaving cloth, all while nurturing their families. These gender roles were not merely suggestions. They were societal blueprints for how a marriage should function. A man was expected to be the breadwinner and decision-maker, while a woman was expected to be his helpmate, focusing on domesticity and procreation. Deviations from these roles could lead to social censure. A man who was perceived as weak or unable to provide for his family would be shamed, while a woman who neglected her household duties or was seen as too independent might be criticized as unwomanly. The church reinforced these roles, presenting the husband as the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. This theological underpinning gave the gender hierarchy a divine sanction. Therefore, when you entered into a medieval marriage, you were expected to willingly accept and diligently perform the duties prescribed by your gender. Understanding that your partnership was a microcosm of the larger social order. Number 5. Understanding that betrothal was almost as binding as marriage itself. In the medieval period, the journey to marriage wasn't always a straightforward leap from singlehood to wedded bliss. There was often a crucial intermediary step, the betrothal. And if you think a modern engagement is a casual affair that can be easily broken, you would be utterly shocked by the weight and binding nature of a medieval betrothal. This wasn't just a promise. In many ways, it was seen as a legally and spiritually binding contract, nearly as solemn and difficult to break as marriage itself. A betrothal, or sponsalia, as it was known in canon law, was a formal agreement between two parties to marry in the future. It was often accompanied by a formal ceremony, witnessed by family and friends, and sometimes involved the exchange of rings or other tokens. The key aspect was the exchange of vows, or verba de futurity, meaning words about the future. For example, a couple might say, "I will marry you," or "I promise to take you as my wife." However, if these words were phrased in the present tense, verba de presenti, like "I take you as my wife," or "I take you as my husband," even if there was no priest present or no formal wedding ceremony, it was considered a valid and binding marriage in the eyes of the Church. This subtle distinction caused immense confusion and legal headaches throughout the Middle Ages, with many disputes arising over whether a couple was merely betrothed or actually married. The expectation was that once betrothed, you were essentially spoken for. Breaking a betrothal was a serious matter, far more significant than simply calling off an engagement today. It could lead to legal action, financial penalties, and significant damage to the reputations of both individuals and their families. The jilted party could sue for breach of promise, often seeking compensation for the wasted dowry negotiations or the damage to their marriage prospects. The social stigma attached to a broken betrothal was immense, especially for women, as it could severely diminish their chances of finding another suitable match. A woman whose betrothal was broken might be seen as tainted or undesirable, even if she was not at fault. Furthermore, sexual relations after a betrothal were often treated with a peculiar legal nuance. While frowned upon if not yet married, if a betrothed couple engaged in sexual intercourse, their betrothal could automatically be considered a full and valid marriage in the eyes of the Church and law, regardless of whether a formal wedding ceremony ever took place. This was a direct consequence of the verba de presenti concept, where the act of consummation combined with the earlier vows could be seen as the ultimate declaration of intent. This meant that a betrothed couple had to be incredibly careful about their physical intimacy, as a moment of passion could irrevocably change their marital status without any further ceremony. So, if you were a medieval bride or a groom, you were expected to view your betrothal not as a tentative step, but as a binding commitment that responsibilities as the marriage itself. It was a serious public declaration, and backing out was not a simple option. It came with heavy social, legal, and financial consequences, underscoring the gravity with which medieval society viewed the path to matrimony. Number 4. Accepting annulment as your only real exit strategy. If you thought medieval marriage was a walk in the park with plenty of out clauses, you are wildly mistaken. One of the most outrageous expectations for medieval brides and grooms was the near impossibility of divorce. Forget about irreconcilable differences or falling out of love. Once you were married for life, period. The only true exit strategy from a binding marriage in the medieval world was an annulment, and getting one was incredibly difficult, costly, and often required the intervention of powerful authorities. The Catholic Church, which held immense power over all aspects of life, considered marriage a holy sacrament, a lifelong and indissoluble bond instituted by God. This meant that a valid marriage, once contracted, could not be broken by human will. There was no concept of divorce in the modern sense, where a marriage is legally dissolved. An annulment, by contrast, was a declaration that a marriage was never valid in the first place, meaning it was defective from the outset according to canon law. It was as if the marriage had never existed. To obtain an annulment, you needed to prove one of a very specific set of impediments. These weren't reasons like, "we don't get along," or "my spouse snores too loudly." They were serious legal and religious barriers. Common grounds for annulment included pre-contract. One of the parties had previously entered into a binding marriage or betrothal with someone else. This goes back to our earlier point about betrothal being almost as binding as marriage. Consanguinity, blood relationship or affinity, relationship by marriage, the parties were too closely related by blood or by marriage. Church's definition of too closely related was incredibly broad, sometimes extending to 7 degrees of kinship, meaning even distant cousins might be deemed too close. This was a particularly popular ground for annulment for powerful families who wanted to escape an inconvenient marriage, as it was often possible to find some distant family connection if you looked hard enough. For example, some rulers would seek annulments on these grounds when they wished to remarry for political gain. Impotence. If one of the parties was physically incapable of consummating the marriage, it could be annulled. This was a critical ground because consummation was often seen as essential to the validity of the marital bond and to fulfill the expectation of procreation. Force or fear. If one party was coerced into the marriage against their will, however, proving this was extremely difficult, especially if the marriage had been ongoing for some time. Lack of proper consent. If one party was mentally incapacitated or too young to truly understand and consent to the marriage, non-consummation. If the marriage was never physically consummated, it could be annulled. This was often used by those who entered religious life after marriage, or if one spouse was genuinely unable or unwilling to have sexual relations. The process for obtaining an annulment was protracted, expensive, and often humiliating. It involved ecclesiastical courts, numerous witnesses, and detailed investigations into the most private aspects of a couple's life. Powerful individuals, like royalty or high-ranking nobles, might have a better chance of pushing through an annulment due to their influence and wealth, but even for them, it was a struggle as exemplified by King Henry VIII's infamous quest for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. For ordinary people, an annulment was largely an unreachable dream. Most simply had to endure unhappy or barren marriages, knowing there was no legal way out. This meant that if you were a medieval person, you were expected to understand that your marriage was a lifelong commitment, and any hope of dissolving it was a rare and difficult undertaking, only possible under very specific and hard-to-prove circumstances. Number 3. Enduring the public scrutiny of your marriage. Forget about a private ceremony, tucked away from prying eyes. In the medieval world, your marriage was not just a personal union. It was a deeply public affair, steeped in community involvement and scrutiny, from its very inception to its ultimate consummation. This expectation meant that every step of your marital journey, from the initial negotiations to the wedding ceremony itself, and even your first night together, was subject to the watchful gaze of neighbors, relatives, and often the entire village or town. There is no escaping the communal spotlight. The very notion of privacy in marriage was largely foreign. Marriage was a matter of public record and community interest because it affected property rights, social standing, and the continuity of lineages. The process often began with public announcements known as banns of matrimony. These announcements were made in the local church for 3 consecutive Sundays, or holy days, before the wedding. The purpose of the bans was to give anyone with a legitimate reason to object to the marriage a chance to come forward. Perhaps one of the parties was already married, or they were too closely related by blood, or there was a prior binding betrothal. This public declaration ensured that the community was aware of the impending union and could act as a check against unlawful or invalid marriages. It placed the burden of upholding the sanctity of marriage not just on the couple, but on everyone in the community. The wedding ceremony itself was typically a highly public event, often taking place at the church door rather than inside the church nave. This was practical, as it allowed a large number of witnesses to observe the vows being exchanged. Witnesses were crucial, as their testimony could later prove the validity of the marriage in case of dispute. The ceremony would include the exchange of vows, often simple declarations of consent, and sometimes the exchange of rings, or a symbolic joining of hands. After the outdoor ceremony, the couple would typically enter the church for a mass, which was then followed by a festive procession, often through the streets, and a public feast or celebration. This public display of joy and commitment served to affirm the marriage's legitimacy within the community. Perhaps one of the most surprising expectations of public scrutiny involved the consummation of the marriage. While not universally practiced, particularly in later medieval periods, the custom of bedding the bride was common, especially among noble and royal families. This involved witnesses accompanying the couple to their bedchamber on their wedding night to ensure that they actually got into bed together, symbolizing the marital union and its expected consummation. Sometimes, these witnesses would even wait outside the door for a period of time, perhaps even waiting for signs of consummation. While the extent of actual direct observation varied, the mere presence of witnesses or the awareness that they were nearby underscored the public nature of the most intimate aspect of marriage. This practice, though seemingly intrusive to modern eyes, served a practical purpose. It provided proof of consummation, which was vital in cases of annulment, as discussed earlier regarding impotence or non-consummation, and for establishing the legitimacy of any future heirs. Public nature of marriage in the Middle Ages meant that your personal life was deeply intertwined with community expectations, and you were expected to uphold and demonstrate your marital status for all to see. Number 2. Submitting to the all-encompassing authority of the Church. If you thought your wedding was just about you and your beloved, think again. In the medieval world, your marriage was first and foremost a sacred sacrament, a holy institution dictated and governed by the formidable authority of the Catholic Church. This meant that the Church's rules, laws, and moral teachings permeated every aspect of your union, shaping your expectations for who you could marry, how you married, and what your life as a married couple would entail. You were not just marrying another person. You were submitting to the comprehensive framework established by canon law and the Church's spiritual directives. Before the 16th century Council of Trent, the specific form of a wedding ceremony was not as rigidly defined as it became later. What truly made a marriage valid in the eyes of the Church was the free consent of both parties, expressed through specific vows. As mentioned before, the verba de praesenti words of the present tense, like "I take you as my wife," spoken by a man and a woman who were capable of marrying and were not under any impediment, automatically created a valid marriage, even without a priest present. This led to many clandestine marriages, which were legally binding but often problematic. The Church, however, increasingly encouraged marriages to take place publicly, often at the church door, with a priest officiating and witnesses present, primarily to prevent disputes and to ensure proper record-keeping. The Church dictated who you could not marry, often more strictly than secular law. The extensive rules on consanguinity, blood relations, and affinity, relations by marriage, were directly imposed by the Church. Marrying within prohibited degrees of kinship was a serious sin and a valid ground for annulment. These rules were so far-reaching that finding a potential spouse not covered by some distant familial tie could be a challenge, especially within tightly knit communities. Church also forbade marriage between Christians and non-Christians, and generally frowned upon marriage to those with certain physical or mental incapacities, or those who had taken holy orders. Beyond the legalities, the Church heavily influenced the moral and social expectations of married life. It emphasized chastity outside of marriage and condemned adultery as a mortal sin. Within marriage, sexual relations were primarily seen as legitimate for the purpose of procreation. While the Church acknowledged companionship and mutual support as aspects of marriage, the spiritual and procreative purposes were paramount. It taught that marriage was indissoluble, a lifelong bond that reflected Christ's union with the Church. This theological stance meant that, as we discussed, divorce was not an option, only annulment under very specific church-defined conditions. Church also exerted influence over the conduct of married life. It encouraged piety within the household, regular church attendance, and adherence to Christian moral principles. Confessors would routinely question individuals about their marital duties and sins. For women, the church emphasized obedience to their husbands, drawing from biblical texts that positioned the husband as the head of the household. For both spouses, the expectation was to uphold the sanctity of their vows, to live in accordance with Christian teachings, and to view their marriage not just as a social contract, but as a spiritual covenant with God overseen and enforced by His earthly representative, the Church. You were expected to understand that your marriage existed not just between you and your spouse, but within the larger, all-encompassing framework of divine law and ecclesiastical authority. Number 1. Facing the uncertainties and pressures of widowhood. Imagine that your medieval marriage has run its course not by annulment or choice, but by the death of your spouse. While you might expect a period of quiet mourning, the medieval world, particularly for women, placed immediate and often intense expectations on you as a widow, shaping your future in ways that might seem surprising today. Widowhood was a precarious state, and your choices, or lack thereof, were dictated by a complex interplay of economic necessity, social norms, and family pressure. For a medieval widow, especially one of means, the first and most immediate expectation was to ensure the stability of her dower. As we discussed, the dower was the portion of her deceased husband's estate set aside for her support. Claiming and securing this dower could be a difficult and often contentious process, particularly if her late husband's family was less than willing to part with the land or income. A widow needed to be strong, resourceful, and often legally astute to ensure her rights were upheld. This was her primary means of survival and maintaining her status. Without it, she could be left destitute, forced to rely on charity or the goodwill of relatives. Pressure to remarry was often immense, particularly for younger widows, and especially if they had inherited substantial property or were still of childbearing age. For women, remarriage offered renewed social status and economic protection. An unmarried widow, even with her dower, was still vulnerable in a society that valued women primarily through their connection to men. A new marriage could provide a protector, a manager for her lands, and a father for her children. For families, the remarriage of a widow could be a strategic opportunity. Her dower lands might be an attractive prospect for another family, and her potential fertility could still contribute to a new lineage. Noble widows were often highly sought after, becoming prizes in the marriage market, with their hand sought by powerful men looking to expand their wealth or influence. This often meant a widow had little say in her second or third marriage, with family or even the crown arranging the match. Eleanor of Aquitaine once again serves as a prime example. Though she was an empress, her options in widowhood were often influenced by powerful political considerations. However, choosing not to remarry also came with its own set of expectations and challenges. An older widow, or one who had already produced heirs, might choose to remain unmarried. This offered a unique, albeit challenging, degree of autonomy in a patriarchal society. She could live independently on her dower, manage her own affairs, and perhaps even exercise some influence within her community. This choice was often met with suspicion, though as an independent woman was somewhat anomalous. For some, entering a convent offered an alternative path, providing spiritual solace and a structured community for those who wished to avoid remarriage or simply embrace a religious life. Regardless of her choice, a widow was expected to mourn appropriately for a period, often wearing specific attire, like the Black Widow's weeds, and to conduct herself with piety and decorum. Any swift remarriage could be seen as disrespectful to the deceased husband's memory and to the family. Furthermore, if she remarried, she often lost control of her dower lands, which would typically revert to her children or her first husband's family. This created a complex calculation for a widow: security versus autonomy, and the immediate economic benefits of remarriage versus the potential loss of her dower and the independence it afforded. So if you found yourself a widow in the Middle Ages, you were expected to navigate a minefield of societal pressures and personal choices, balancing financial survival, family expectations, and your own limited agency in a world that offered few truly independent paths for women.